Okay. So, hello and good afternoon and warm greetings. Welcome to the virtual book discussion on migration and development in India, the BIHAR experience. I am Priyanka Tyagi. I work as Senior Manager, Program Administration and Communication with Institute for Human Development. This book with the same title deals with a wide range of issues related to rural-urban migration in the context of neoliberal economic development in India and has been published by Rutledge, Taylor and Francis. Before we formally commence the proceedings of this panel discussion, I would like to thank all the participants for their response to this discussion. The conference is also available live on IHD's YouTube channel. Just go on YouTube and please type IHD India. This discussion is being live streamed there. You are welcome to place your questions through the Q&A box, which is there on your screens right now. And people on YouTube, you can engage with us through the comment box. We are joined by an eminent set of panelists here. This book discussion is being moderated by Dr. Jerry Rogers. He is visiting Professor IHD and is former Director, International Institute of Labor Studies, ILO Geneva. The book has been written by Dr. Amrita Datta, former faculty of IHD. She is now with the Department of Liberal Arts, IIT Hyderabad, and visiting fellow at IHD. The panelists in this discussion are Professor Ravi Srivastav. He is Professor and Director, Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development, and also a former professor from JNU, New Delhi. Professor P.P. Ghosh, he's Director and Member Secretary, Asian Development Research Institute, Patna, and Ms. Divya Verma, she's Director, Center for Migration and Labour Solutions, Ajivika Bureau. I would now like to call upon Professor Alakhen Sharma. He's the Director of the Institute for Human Development, New Delhi. He is a development economist who has made significant contributions to research in varied areas such as livelihoods, labor migration, poverty, employment, labor markets, political economy, and related issues. He has pioneered a panel data study on agrarian change in Bihar, which has systematically focused on issues relating to labor migration from the state. Migrants were also in the state. Professor Sharma is also the editor of Indian Journal of Labor Economics, the quarterly journal of the Indian Society of Labor Economics, and Indian Journal of Human Development. I invite him to please commence the proceedings of this online book discussion with his introductory remarks.
Thanks, Priyanka. No need of such a big introduction. Very happy New Year and warm welcome to all the friends who have joined online this book discussion on migration and development in India, the BIHAR experience, authored by Amrita Datta and published by Rutledge. Migration is usually underestimated in India, and there is utter lack of clarity on this topic. The secondary data system in India, mainly census and national sample surveys, fail to capture this phenomena given its complexity. And the migrants remain largely invisible in the place of destination. The coming on in the streets and returning to the villages of hundreds of thousands of migrants in the wake of COVID pandemic amply demonstrate the utter failure of not only data system, official data system on migration, but also lack of clarity, policy on migration in India. Clearly, there is a need of much more study, systematic study, and also better ways of capturing migration process, migration data in official system, and many more micro studies on this phenomenon of migration. This book by Amrita is based on field data from Bihar, which is, in my view, will be an important contribution to the process of migration. Amrita was a regular faculty and researcher in IHD for several years. And even after relocating to IIT Hyderabad, and before that Pune, maybe some 3 years back, 3-4 years back, she continues to be associated with us as a visiting faculty, visiting fellow. We consider Amrita a close part of IHD, and she contributes to our activities. I am very happy that this book is based on 3 rounds of longitudinal Bihar survey data, 98, 2000, 2009, 11, and 2016. Amrita was a senior researcher, at least in 2 rounds of this longitudinal data, 2009, 11, and 2016. And she was a part of Bihar research program under which these data were collected. In 2009-11, Jerry, Jenin, and of course I was there. Apart from Begrisha, my colleague Sunil Mishra was there, part of this Bihar research program. This longitudinal database, which I consider to be a very important database on longitudinal surveys in India, owed its origin to 12 or 36 villages in Bihar, which started in 1981-83 in N. Sinha Institute of Social Studies under the leadership of Jerry Rogers and my late teacher, Professor Pradhan Prasad at N. Sinha Institute. I was a young faculty at N. Sinha Institute at that time, and I worked with Jerry and Professor Pradhan Prasad. Later on, when the ISD was started in 98, we resurveyed these villages in 36 villages. Earlier, we had done 36 villages in 81-83, but in-depth survey was done only in 12 villages as a part of the research design. I'm not going in detail to this because I have to give only introductory and there are imminent set of panelists. But this survey showed, apart from many things, many papers were published, a book has also come. How important is migration in the process of development in Bihar? Where 2/3 of the people, youth migrate, mainly males, to various parts of India, largely outside Bihar, or mainly outside Bihar. In fact, even when Bihar GDP was not growing, poverty was declining. Later on, of course, the GDP started rising. And the major reason for decline in poverty, tightening of labor markets in Bihar, is due to the process of migration. I think the semi-feudal system, which was characterized in Bihar, was largely broken because of the changes brought out by migration in Bihar. I am very happy that Amrita has taken forward this in studying deeply with in-depth the process of migration based on this longitudinal data, which was done under IHD, and published this book. I'm sure that it will be a very important contribution to the process of migration, understanding the process of migration, not only in India, but in the entire country, particularly the backward out-migrating regions. There's a very eminent set of panelists and resource persons in this panel. Jerry, who pioneered this longitudinal data survey in 81, and I was fortunate to be part of that in Ancient Institute, is there as a moderator. Panelist Ravi is Ravi Srivastava, my colleague, is you might be knowing, a very well-known researcher on migration in the country with a lot of contribution. In fact, he has been also advising us on the IHD longitudinal survey, even though he was not in ISD at that time. Dr. P.P. Ghosh, Director, ADRI, though not directly connected with the survey, but I consider him a part of the survey in 81-83, when I was young faculty. He was much senior to me, and we were the beneficiaries of his knowledge and wisdom at that time also. Divya Verma, she also well known for her work on migration, and Ajivika Bureau is an organization in our country which is doing very important work on migration, including interventions. So with these words, and I am very happy that Janine is always also able to join. She was part of all these surveys along with us in this longitudinal survey in Bihar. And of course, our intervention, even briefly, will be very important for us. So with these words, I welcome all of you to this book discussion, and thank you for your participation. Thank you.
I now request Professor Jerry Rogers to please take over the reins of this book discussion in his hands and moderate the online book discussion.
Thank you. Well, I was very pleased when Amrita asked me whether I would moderate this discussion of her book, not only because I appreciate her work, though I do, of course, but also because of the importance of the subject of today's session. Migration is an essential part of many people's lives, for better or for worse. But above all, it interacts with development in many ways, both of cause and consequence. And that's what Amrita has documented so effectively in this book. And that was brought home to me when working in rural Bihar. As Alak has said, back in the 1970s and 1980s, situation in rural Bihar was appalling. Poverty was widespread. Life expectancy was low. And there was some distress migration driven by an extreme need for work and income. But migration was low because the semi-feudal agrarian system with its mechanisms of bondage restricted the freedom to migrate. And then between the 1980s and the 1990s, something changed. And when we went back to villages in Bihar at the end of the 1990s, we found a visible improvement in living conditions. And as Alak has just said, the weakening of social controls in the villages had led to an explosion of migration alongside growing opportunities elsewhere in India, and that had radically changed the process of development. And there are many facets to this. They're good, and there are good facets and bad, and that's what Amrita is exploring in depth. But the important point was that migration was an essential part of the change. Now, let me briefly, you've already had an introduction to the speakers, but let me just briefly say something about the speakers. As it was said, Amrita is presently Assistant Professor of Development Studies at IIT Hyderabad. She has a doctorate from Erasmus University in the Netherlands, and her thesis is the source this book. And she has been working on migration for some time. I know her work well because we worked together at IHD on the project that Alec had been talking about. And it was always a great pleasure to work with Amrita, who is building up an impressive research record. After Amrita's presentation, the three discussants will be, first of all, Ravi Srivastava, who after a long career as Professor of Economics at JNU, joined IHD some years back, as Alex said. He was educated at the Delhi School of Economics and at Cambridge, where he did his PhD. And his many achievements include his membership of the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector. But above all, for the purposes of this event, he's been one of India's foremost researchers on migration for many years and has published extensively on the topic. After Ravi, the second speaker will be P.P. Ghosh, director of ADRI in Patna, who, like Ravi, is a good friend, going back also to the 1980s when we were working together at the A.N. Sinha Institute in Patna. And starting with his PhD at Patna University, he's been engaged in research in Bihar ever since, including, among other projects, a major research project on migration. But above all, PP has been helping not only to build up knowledge on Bihar's development over the years, but also contributed substantially to the strengthening of research institutions in the state. And the third discussant, Divya Verma, is the director of the Center for Migration and Labor at the Ajivika Bureau, which is perhaps the most important institution in India today, providing support to research on advocacy for migrant workers. And Divya, who was a Fulbright scholar, with a degree in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. She's directed a major project on the access of migrants to public services in urban areas. And she has a substantial research record on a variety of development policy research issues, as well as engaging with stakeholders on policy issues. So this is a high-powered panel to discuss a high-powered book. So I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I would like to pass the floor to Amrita to present her book.
Right. Thanks so much, Jerry. For your words, and also to Alex sir for introducing the context of this work and how it's coming from a broader migration, a broader study of social and economic change in rural Bihar. So I'll share my screen so that you are able to see the presentation, and just one sec. Right. Right. So, as Professor Sharma and Professor Rogers explained, this work is largely, it's coming from surveys which have been done at IHD, and it's been a long time in the making. I started working at IHD in 2009 on this research project. And at that time, I had no idea that this would move into something like this. So I was very fortunate to work on the longitudinal study starting 2009. And then I was involved in data collection and subsequent surveys in 2011 and 2016. So, and I started working on migration very early on, and I was very fascinated by what was going on in Bihar. And so much so that, I also decided to work on migration for my PhD in development studies, broadly in the framework of migration and development research. So what this book really does is it uses data from the same sets of villages and households from 1998-99 that already existed at IHD. And then data since 2000 on in 2009, 11, and subsequently in 16, I was involved in collecting data along with the entire research team. And then in 2014, I did some part of work for my PhD, which was qualitative work. And in 2016, we also had a very special migration module for the first time. So the book really, in a sense, put all of this work together and, to better understand the patterns and dynamics of migration from rural Bihar. So, and then we had COVID, when internal migration really came to the forefront of the policy discourse. And so this book also, though the data is largely pre-COVID, it also helps understand the structural nature of migration and therefore understand why the crisis of migration is not going to be resolved anytime soon. So, so just moving on to the structure of my presentation, which is largely structured on the book, but I obviously don't have time to cover everything. So what I'm going to try and do is I'm going to try and give you some glimpses of the book. So this book is largely a multidisciplinary endeavor, and it does three broad things. So what I try to do first is I try to look at the state discourses on rural-urban migration in India since the 1930s, and critically trying to look at industrial, labor, rural development policies, and urban programs. And this is broadly the second chapter of the book, which is after the introductory chapter. Then through data on longitudinal surveys undertaken in Bihar, we look at the characteristics of migration, which is in chapter 3. Then I look at the changes and the patterns of migration and sources of income, which is in chapter 4. Then estimate the determinants and impact in chapter 5. And this is largely rooted in an economic framework, and it offers a source area perspective. This is followed by work based on qualitative work, field work in both the village and the city. And subsequent chapters present an in-depth account of this one stream of a village-city migration stream, which focuses on young people's experiences and shows that how rural-urban migration at destination is embedded in source area households, family dynamics. And this work is largely qualitative. It tries to integrate source and destination area perspectives, and it sort of draws from the disciplines of sociology and human geography. And in the final chapter, I conclude with the policy implications which emerge from the research. So very broadly, I don't want to spend much time on introduction because this audience would be familiar. But one of the things that, that has been is that there's been a very dominant narrative of low internal migration in India. And one of the things COVID did was that it countered this narrative when, after COVID, when you had thousands of migrants stranded across the country. So why do we have this dominant narrative of low internal migration? So largely we have early demographers, like Kingsley Rayfus, emphasize on social institutions that explain the low migration from rural areas. Then more recently, we have economists like Kaiwan Munshi and Mark Rosen's work, who argue that Jati and other Jati act as a constraining factor in migration because they provide risk-sharing networks, so therefore they constrain migration. Then you have more recent work by Zovangakorn and colleagues at the World Bank, who argue that domicile-based entitlements and domicile-based access to education and public employment play a role in restricting migration. And then there's enough work, including important work by Professor Ravi Srivastava, that shows that, how census and NSSO invisibilize migrant workers because they show that migration rates are really low in India, much lower than what they actually are. And then on the other hand, we have a whole host of micro studies in recent years which show that migration rates are actually quite high and that they are increasing. And then for the first time, we have an economic survey that in 2017, the one and only chapter on migration that we have had, which acknowledges that official data sets underestimate migration and sort of proposes some alternative measures to calculate migration. So, but the sum and substance of the matter really is, as noted by the working group on migration, that we have estimates that vary widely, and they are fraught with methodological concerns. So, which is why it's really important to have evidence-informed data. I mean, data which will help us understand estimates related to migration. So then I think with this broad context, in the first chapter in the book, I look at policy documents, the 5-year plans, the Labor Commission reports, and so on. And what broadly emerges is that, and I look at it in a chronological manner. So in pre-independent India, largely two major reports, the Rege Committee and the Whitley Commission report, they were very vocal about the issue of labor migration. They had very different perspectives, but they were very vocal about the issue of labor migration. So while rural-urban migration was an important policy question in pre-independent India, the state became increasingly silent about this after independence. And then there was a fundamental contradiction that emerged in the state discourse, that industrialization was necessary for development, but migration was not desirable. And then we have the Green Revolution, which saw massive migration of labor of agricultural labor to northwestern India, and the labor commissions cover this by specifically highlighting the plight of migrant workers. And then in the post-liberalization period, we've had a growing recognition that migrants are clearly important actors in an economic sense, but we still have a disconnect between urbanization and migration. And therefore, in the state's discourse, we find that while urbanization is clearly desirable, the state's view on migration remains ambivalent, and you have rural and urban policies which are mutually exclusive. So therefore, migration is predominantly framed as a problem. Then we have the structure where we have a federal state with multiple actors, right? And each actor so if we look at three distinct actors, the source state, the destination state, and the central government, we find that they have very, very different perspectives on migration, right? So in the context of a sending state like that of BIHAR, there's little acknowledgement of migration simply because migration is seen as a failure of local development. So even within the state government, we hear that there are claims that migration is declining, but this is not really evidence informed. Then what about the destination states? So we have labor laws which mandate that host states must protect migrant workers, but we know very well that there's tremendous hostility towards migrant workers on the one hand. We have nativist laws which have been passed by several states, and in an economic sense, there's no recognition of migrants' contribution to the economy. And then when we come to the central government, we find that there is, of course, an invisibilization of migrants because the data sources collected don't capture migration in a rational way. And then you have ministries such as, the rural development, urban development ministries that operate in silos. And so what you really have is a little interface between the two. And so overall, the chapter suggests that, the dialectics of rural-urban migration and the federal structure, which contributes to some kind of a vertical and horizontal segmentation, leads to very contradictory state narratives and ultimately the absence of a coherent discourse on rural-urban migration in India. And then I move on now to the empirical findings. So as Professor Sharma and Professor Rogers already pointed out that about the history of the work, so I'm not going to spend much time here, but largely what we have is, we have 7 study districts in Bihar: Gaya, Gopalganj, Madhubani, Nalanda, Purnia, Rarya, and Rohtas. And there are 36 villages and there are 12 core villages which have been studied. Same households have been studied over time. In 98, 99, there were 891 households. 2009-11, there were 904. In 2016, there were 1588 households. So I'm not going into the detail of the sampling right now, but broadly, the districts that were selected were representative of the state, and the data can be considered to be fairly representative. Right. So, so we now come to the migration patterns from the primary survey. So we can see between 1999 and 2016, migration measured by the percentage of households with at least one migrant member increased in all the study districts. So you have the districts of North Bihar, particularly Gopalganj and Madhubani, you can see, where you have which have a history of floods, a history of being relatively poor and backward. So migration has been higher there than South Bihar. And over time, this pattern continues, the pattern of higher migration in North Bihar. So on the whole, migration rates increased from 45% in 1999 to 62% in 2011 and 65% in 2016. So on an average, you have 2 and 3 households with a migrant member. You can also see that there is a variation by district, by class, and other social categories. And migration is relatively lower in peasant households. You have OBC2 castes that are largely involved in agriculture, like the Kurmis and the Koiris. Migration tends to be relatively lower there. But on the whole, we find that there's been a convergence across North and South Bihar districts, and also convergence across caste and class categories as far as migration rates are concerned. We also find that migration has become longer term. So what do we mean when we say longer term? So a majority of migrant workers are working at destination areas for more than 8 months in a year. And this, so you can see how this has been increasing over time. And so workers are really embedded in long-term occupations elsewhere, away from the village. And these are largely urban occupations. We can see more of this when we look at the results from the 2011 survey, where we're looking at the number of months migrated in the last 12 months. So you can clearly see that about 2/3 of the migrants migrate for 10 months or more in the year. So I'm not showing employment data here, but what is really clear that workers that are migrants largely work in destination areas for long periods, and therefore they're quite de-linked from the local labor markets. Then we can also see that migration is gendered. So migration streams are masculinized when men go to distant urban labor markets to work, and women stay behind and they care for their homes and they care for their farms and children and elderly. And this gendered nature of migration is you can find that both source and destination area perspectives contribute to it. At destination, migration is so exclusionary and the wages are so low that workers are unable to bring their families, and they need to keep the source area households going as well. So households literally have one foot in the village and one foot in the city while they practice migration. You can also see that migration is youth dominated. So migration largely peaks in the ages of 25 to 29, after which it tapers. And migrant workers eventually return to the village, not to retire, but to work again in the rural labor market, and so that they are able to do less demanding work than what the urban economy demands. So therefore, we find that for rural urban migrant, migration is largely a function of sex and life cycle. And in the econometric analysis done, I find that over time, age and sex have become even more important markers, determinants of migration over time, and this then mirrors the increasing demand for casual labor at destinations. So those were broadly one set of results on the characteristics of migration. The next thing I want to cover from the surveys is how income sources have changed over time. So broadly, the survey captures sources of income. And they have been classified in income from agriculture, income from non-agriculture, government programs, and income from remittances. These are the four broad heads, and it might be noted that the remittances are only that part of a migrant's income that are sent back to the rural households, and we don't consider the full migrant income. So I will quickly take you through the results. We look at the changes in income sources. Yeah, I'm sorry for so much clutter on the screen. So we're looking at the changes between 1999 and 2016 in non-migrant and migrant households. So NM is for non-migrant and M is for migrant. And so the first is the case of agricultural incomes from self-employment. And this we find that this has declined in both migrant and non-migrant households. Why is this so? This is largely because costs of cultivation has increased, and peasant households find it less and less remunerative to cultivate. There's also a decline in the share of livestock, but that's more muted. Then attached labor, which was present in some pockets of North Bihar in the earlier surveys, has virtually disappeared, so we don't have no income from there. What we also have over the time, it has been an increase first and then a decline in local non-agricultural income. And so I've discussed in the book that households in the upper income quintiles have disproportionately been able to move out of agriculture, and the poorer households, particularly households which are exclusively dependent on agriculture, are stuck in the lower quintiles. So therefore, what we find is that first, being able to move away from the local economy or migration is a pathway to higher income and a movement away from poverty. When we estimate the impacts of migration, we find that remittances contribute to increased household income and therefore welfare. But what we also find is that income from local non-agricultural sources can be another way to escape poverty. However, this is much less accessible to those in the lower quintile. So the overall picture that we get is that migration is quite broad-based. It's accessed by households across caste and class. And on the other hand, access to local non-agricultural work is quite narrow, which is available mostly to households in the upper quintile. So everybody is not able to take the route of non-agricultural work. We find government programs are significant. They contribute to about 12% of overall incomes. We also find that there's positive targeting of government programs, and female-headed households have a larger share of government program, which is a good thing. So broadly, we find that there have been major changes in the composition of income between 1999 and 2016. On the one hand, there has been a decline of agricultural income and a simultaneous increase in non-farm income as well as remittances. So there is some livelihood diversification. But on the whole, as migration has deepened and remittances have increased, agriculture has suffered. And by 2016, agriculture contributed only to 20% of the income. And the non-farm sector growth has been constrained, and it's been unable to take off in the context of an economy which is so dependent on migration, where migration is both a cause and consequence of development. So, and we also find that commuting is a pathway to higher incomes, and villages where there is an option of commuting, villages that have a higher rate of commuting have lower rates of migration. And therefore, that then we can argue that there is some evidence that commuting and migration may be substitutes. The analysis so far drew on source area surveys. These were rural surveys, and one of the next steps for me really to address some of the questions was to examine migration at destination. So to do this, I study in detail one village city stream of migration. The village is a village that is in North Bihar, which is Mahisham, which is a remote village, flood prone. Traditionally, agriculture was dominant, but now it's a remittance-led village. And the migration stream I study is from Mahisham to Delhi. So this work is largely based on interviewing migrant workers in the city and their family members in the village to synthesize urban and rural perspectives of the same migration. So I'll quickly take you through the findings here. And so broadly, work at destination, what is it that workers do? What's the nature of work, conditions of work? So the activities of migrants I interviewed can be located largely in Delhi's informal economy that had local and global linkages. Now, migrants were employed in diverse sectors, and their work conditions varied by sector. But one thing that was common was that they worked at least 12 hours a day. Migrants who were in wage work did about 12 hours a day, and those who were self-employed worked longer. And most migrant workers worked less than the stipulated wages. In all cases, the work that they did not pay them minimum wages, and workers were largely not aware of legal entitlements, and there was an environment of lax implementation of labor laws. But having said that, there were some transitions. There were some very clear transitions from wage work to self-employment, and own-account work was largely preferred by migrant workers, and because it gave them a sense of ownership of their work, pride in their work. And largely the perspectives migrants had towards self-employment are quite contrary to what we find in the in official discourses that link self-employment with poverty. Then migrants were very dependent on social networks. They were very important for migrants, not only in terms of accessing the labor market, but also in terms of their social lives. And very often then, because their life was so ghettoized, the same social networks that helped them access urban employment also may have come in the way of impeded their prospects of better work. Then this is something which came across very strongly, how migrants had very limited interaction with the city, and they were largely working hard, saving and remitting for the rural household. And this is very different. This is contrary to the literature in other parts of Asia, where migrants experience the city much more and engage with the city much more. And their social work was really largely comprised of their fellow villagers and so on. Then I think the main question is that, and this comes across in a lot of literature as to why is it that they bear the urban ignominy. And largely, I think through the narratives, what clearly comes out is that while they were able to exploit economic opportunities that the city offered, it was very evident that they worked in very exploitative conditions, and they chose to do so. And I think when we try and look at the dialectics of the village and the city, that migrants have largely internalized the feeling that they don't belong to the city. For them, it's just a means of livelihood. What they get from the city goes back to the village. So urban income really is the means for a better rural life. And they know that this will eventually culminate in a final return to the village, and they continue to work for monetary gains. So why is it that migrants expect so little from the city? And this is perhaps, rooted in their perception of the transience of their own migrations. I find it useful here to refer to Arjun Appadurai's work, where he discusses about the limited capacity to aspire. And this is also largely to do with how migrants would prefer to work in the village. Even though incomes are much higher in migrant households, migrants' perspectives themselves focus on preference of working in the village if they have a choice. And so over here, they do this. They don't want to work in agriculture. They don't want to work in traditional occupation. They desire alternative work in the village. And they are willing to do what they do in the city, in the village, if they are able to live outside the shadow of dominant caste. And over here, in this context, I'd like to argue that migrants practice some kind of economic rejection in the village, but they still want social acceptance. And they do indeed want to live in the village if work in the domain of dignity is available. And so so when you talk of the future, largely these are first generation migrant workers. And these trajectories would obviously change depending upon what the nature of the city is, what the nature of the city's acceptance of the migration is. But we don't see that changing very much, even more after COVID, where cities have become so structurally hostile. So to broadly end, I just want to conclude with some policy implications that emerge from this empirical work. So clearly, we find that the state's approach towards migration is fundamentally opposite to the nature of the development process. While the state aims to contain, curb, reduce migration, its service-oriented economy demands cheap labor from rural areas, and the demand for this labor is only increased over time. Then historically, we have had an urban bias in the state's development process. So most migrant workers eventually return to the village after their working lives. And this really suggests that rural areas are bearing the cost of production and reproduction of this labor, and therefore subsidizing India's urban development. Then something which is very closely related to the circularity of migration is how exclusionary the urbanization process is. And it's very clear from the income data that migrants' remuneration and destination is inadequate for family migration or for long-term settlement. And this circularity of migration then goes on to have very severe implications for India's urbanization project, which is very low. Urbanization rates are 31%, very low. And the sluggish rate of rural-urban transition is very closely intertwined with the circularity of migration, and it sort of impediments our structural transformation ambitions. Then, of course, you have migrants that live in the margins of the city. There's little acknowledgement of their contribution to the economy. To the contrary, they're blamed for social and economic problems in destination. And this backlash has become really quite much in recent years, where we have nativist laws by many destination states which are quite unconstitutional. And then we have policy discourses which paint migrants to be passive victims. So we find that migration is beneficial in very many ways, and despite exploitation in the labor market, migrants exercise their agency and they make very informed decisions about their work in life. And so therefore, while migration can be hugely beneficial in economic terms, there's a huge social cost that we find has hardly any mention in the policy discourse. This is separation of family members that migrants must endure, that family members must endure, so as to reap the benefits of additional incomes that migration provides. And lastly, with all the conversations right now about portability and so on, broadly, the state continues to view its citizens as static, located either in urban or rural areas. And this research demonstrates that migrant workers actually traverse urban and rural spaces, industrial and agricultural work, and therefore there's an urgent need to incorporate multiple spatialities in state development policies, including portability of benefits. I think I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amrita, for that clear and rich and well-structured presentation. A lot of information to absorb. So we have the three discussants now. I guess I like Priyanka. It's what, about 10 minutes each for the discussants, something like that?
Yes.
Yeah. So the first discussant is Ravi Srivastava.
Thanks, Jerry. And thanks to Alak and Amrita for inviting me to join this discussion. It was highly interesting to read this book, even though I must say it was very painful reading it on the screen. It's a long book, and in parts it's a very dense book. But Amrita brings a lovely pluralist perspective into a discussion, and as an economist, that itself is very interesting. The book is very well written. The introductory chapters, the later chapters, which really, in some sense, flow directly from her work, the qualitative pieces, and then, of course, the concluding chapter itself. It's pluralist both from within the economics tradition that it draws on, though, as Amrita says, it's closest to the new economics or labor migration perspective in some ways, but also pluralist in its multidisciplinary perspective. And this is, of course, demonstrated amply by the final chapters in the book, particularly chapter 7, which looks at the experience of, looks at two case studies of young people who migrated from the village in North Bihar to Delhi. So congratulations, Amrita, for your own work and also for bringing to, in some sense, fruition this long-standing work done by the Institute of Human Development, starting with Jerry's work actually before the Institute of Human Development, and in which Alak was also involved at the A.N. Sinha Institute, and looking at all of this in a longitudinal perspective. Bihar has been, the outmigration from Bihar has been, in some sense, has been a very strong presence in the cultural and popular imagination of Bihar. The state which I come from, UP, and the part of UP that I come from, East UP, shares a lot of this perspective with Bihar. And in both states, outmigration has been a part of really the popular imagination and cultural perspective. In rural areas in UP and in Bihar, there are folk songs which center around the lives of women left behind, sung at times at the harvesting time, and when they do interculture in the cropping season. There is a very popular form which I'm sure most people who are hearing this would have heard, the BIHAR, which is really women's pining for their husbands who have gone to work outside. But in fact, even the other songs that are sung, the other folk traditions that are there, draw a great deal from the emotions and the feelings of women who are left behind and are pining for the near and dear ones who have gone to work abroad. The modern history of migration, labor migration in Bihar itself is now nearly 200 years old. It started with the history of indenture, in 1830s, and that's only the modern history. I'm not going further back into the history. But then Bihar, as it was then part of the Bengal province, there was a great deal of, Bihar, the Bihari labor fueled industrialization in West Bengal, as it did also actually, a lot of this labor was supplied to the plantations in Assam, both indentured as well as non-indentured labor. And Bihar, I'm including, of course, Jharkhand, because that, as it stood then, Jharkhand was also a part of Bihar then. So you have a very long tradition, and it also has a very long tradition of studies on migration. Studies on migration, which looked at indenture, looked at out-migration of central Bihar. My dear friend, the late Arvind Das's work on his own village, reconstructing both the history of agrarian change and migration. The work by Maharaj, which looked at agrarian change and migration, the interrelated histories of agrarian change and migration in the early 70s, his pioneering work, which actually remained unpublished, which he did in the National Labour Institute, which very closely looked at the dynamics of change, agrarian change. It was one of the most interesting pieces of work which was then done. And then, of course, the work done at A.N. Sinha Institute, which again focused both on agrarian change and migration. And then subsequently, the All India, the work that we have at the national level, which also focused a great deal on migration, beginning, and I think but the pioneering work which was done by the Institute of Development Studies, in which Biplab played a very major role in the 70s, and which brought to it a compendium, which was a compendium actually of work on migration from all over the country. And it was also very significant because this study talked about different forms of migration, including seasonal migration. And subsequently, the National Commission for Rural Labour, which was again very unique because it focused on intra-rural migration and seasonal migration. So we have a lot of pioneering stuff. We have a history of very good studies on migration. At the same time, there are conundrums on migration studies in migration studies. And you look at several, Amrita's book looks at several of these conundrums. One is, of course, the very definition of migration. Who is a migrant? Of course, the census and the NSS cannot be faulted for taking a narrow definition of migrant because the census job is to count people in the country, and double counting is a hazard. So it cannot look at, it draws the line at 6 months and it counts people only if they have been in an area for more than 6 months as a migrant. The NSS also draws a similar line in terms of the duration of the migrant before the person is enumerated as destination. But the other end, they really miss out. And this is something which, of course, I've talked about for almost 3 decades. They miss out on the seasonal and circular migrants, which are of much shorter duration. But when you look at this from an out-migration perspective, then you do see the links between longer-term migration. So the fact that a person is migrated for more than 6 months seems to matter very little, because this person still has very strong organic links with the village and with his or her household. And that is why long-term migration, which would not figure as out migration in the census definition, becomes very much part and parcel of the migration studies when they look at out migrating regions. And then there is a further, of course, divide here, because the census and the NSS, if you look at them, then 80% of migrants that they enumerate are women migrants. Thanks to exogamous marriages, women form the majority of migrants as enumerated in the census and the NSS. But when we look at migration and when we take a cutoff point as 8 months and so on, it's normal to leave out women who are part of the exogamous marriages, so that you get a much narrower set. So, for example, the data set that has been used by Amrita in her book refers mainly to male migrants. The book is not, the data set is not really only about male labor migrants or male worker migrants, but because of the way migration is defined, although some migrants are students, they're non-workers, they include women who are non-workers, so they are probably accompanying migrants to male workers, but the majority of them turn out to be male workers, single male workers. So, and which is true, of course. The earners who go abroad, the go to work in other states or even in urban areas, generally tend to be males. Even if they maintain a tenuous relationship with their villages, coming back once a village, there is a strong relationship in terms of remittances and so on. But this is a very difficult exercise. Drawing a line when in migration studies between, and particularly when you look at it from an out-migrating perspective between who is a migrant, who is not a prime migrant, the line is very thin. But however you do draw the line, Bihar has always had a very strong history of out-migration. I carried out the Living Standards Migration Survey in Bihar in the late 90s, almost at the same period that the 98 to 99 Bihar migration study was conducted by IHD. And I found that the incidence of migration, in fact, in Bihar households was very high, probably higher than that enumerated in the IHD survey at that point, actually significantly higher at that point of time. But as you correctly point out, longitudinal studies, and this is really the importance of the IHD set of studies, that they form a longitudinal panel database, do show that migration increased over time. And that migration tended to be more long-term than short-term. Over a period of time, it became more long-term and short-term. Nonetheless, it did not reduce the vulnerability of those migrants who are at the lower end of the labor market spectrum. I think one does need to differentiate between the study does differentiate between migrants, and it does point out that migration became more and more differentiated as time went on, with the more well-off rural households, the incidence of migration increasing in the more well-off rural households, whether they came from upper caste or from, in fact, indeed from the other backward classes. But this differentiation among migrants means that this differentiation was maintained to some extent in destination areas. And it is at the lower end that you see a different kind of vulnerability. I don't think that the higher end, we see so much vulnerability. The higher end also, migration has been always a part of the Bihar culture for a long period of time. It was earlier more to the local urban destinations within Bihar, and then later on it became more interstate and more long distance migration. Well, so I think that the fact that so many people have always migrated from Bihar, both seasonally and now long term, has important implications for the development of Bihar and in interrelationship with Bihar, as it has with the development, as you point out very correctly, with the rest of the country. The migrant labor has always been a source of development in the growth centers, in urban areas, in the rest of the country, something which has been downplayed because of the way data has been handled, data has been enumerated. There are two things, and time is short. I will just focus on 2 or 3 things which your study points out, which is also a conundrum as far as I am concerned. Given that the modern history of migration is, nearly 200 years old, how is it that migration coexisted with a great deal of stability, over this long period of time? That it did not, for example, that it did not lead to the kind of consequences that we speak about now, or that the book speaks about. For example, did it not lead to labor market tightening in the 1900s or the early part of the 20th century? If it did not, is it only because the incidence of migration was very low? But studies point out that this was not indeed the case. I mean, at least, in many areas, the incidence of migration from BIHAR was already quite high. Nonetheless, there was remarkable stability in terms of both production relations and productive forces in BIHAR, despite the high level of out-migration. Your study, interestingly, actually points out that it was in the 90s, and from the 90s onwards, and then of course the 2000s, it points out quite starkly that migration both contributed to a decline in poverty, but it also contributed to a decline in inequality in BIHAR. Now, is this something? Is it because of the under enumeration, or because we are looking primarily at rural incomes? Because we are not looking at inequality in a more complete sense. If you look at inequality in a more complete sense, I think one would find that migrant households at the upper end of the spectrum also earn more in urban settings. So if you combine rural and urban incomes, then perhaps the impact of inequality or on inequality may not be as significant as is made out only by rural data. Because in rural data,
Ravi, could you keep an eye on the time, please?
Yeah, this is, I would certainly see. So I think there are very important, on policy, I have, this is something which I've written about for a long time, and I'm glad that, Amrita is able to link the discourse and also the various perspectives that she draws in with the policy discourse. And I completely agree with her, the question of invisibilization of migration in India. And also that the fact that there's the discourse on migration policy has been quite incoherent in India. And actually, despite the crisis that we have seen, it still lacks coherence in many important ways. So this is something that needs to be thought through by most of us who work on migration research in India. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ravi. PP? PP, could you unmute, please?
First, I have to congratulate Amrita for this comprehensive text on migration in BIHAR. I didn't have time to read the whole book, but I did manage to get a rapid reading of the book. Most important part of this book, there has been migration studies before in BIHAR, probably a number of them. But what distinguishes this study from the rest one is the fact that it is a longitudinal study. To the extent it is a longitudinal study, it helps us to identify many of the important changes that are taking place in migration pattern over not years, but over decades, let's say. For example, one thing that is the rate of migration, I think in this study, it showed as 42 and then 60 and then something like 70. And some people think that we have almost reached the plateau position. It will not go further up. It is so 70% one. That's a very important study, important conclusion. Another fact which Amrita has mentioned somewhere in the beginning of the book, that apart from the rate of migration, the destination pattern has changed considerably over the last, again, at least 50 years or maybe even 100 years. Initially, it was eastbound to Bengal and Kolkata. Major change took place in 70s with the Green Revolution. And there are also a number of studies. And then, of course, we have, I think even western part of India now accounts for a larger number of varied migrants, plus the Delhi metropolitan area or around that area, Delhi, Gurgaon, etc., etc. I do not have estimate about that, but I remember having read one paper based on the 2011 census migration data, where all the states were, for all these states, someone has calculated the net migration, out-migration rate. Out of the 30 odd states in India, about the smaller ones, I'm not talking about Delhi, out of the major ones, 16 or 18, only 4 states show out-migration to be, out-migration to be less than in-migration. And these states are Gujarat, Maharashtra, Punjab, and Karnataka. These are the 4 states, as I remember. From these places, people do not go out, but many people come in. I think this net migration rate can be calculated for 2011, one census, 2011 census, and whenever you get the next one, 2011, to show the movement of labor across the country, from which states to which state. A third thing that I want to mention, that in the beginning we mentioned that internal migration rates in India are low. Yes, they are low, but we have to remember that it's not uniformly low across the country. And there are states where the rates are very high, and obviously BIHAR is one of them. I won't be surprised if he falls also in that category. I do not know about other states. These are the 2 states, I am sure, where the out-migration rate will be in very high, very high. And that's had to be captured by someone. Another thing that I want to point out, that you see, in this study, we are talking about migration of workers. But in most, across the country, whenever you see the urbanization pattern, you will see that, let me tell you, between 2001 and 2011, the urbanization percentage in India has gone up something like 3.5%. That's the national average. There might be states where it must have gone might slightly. Tamil Nadu is one of them. Tamil Nadu has now almost 40% urban area and 60% urban. In contrast, in BIHAR, the difference between urbanization rate in 2001 and 2011 is only 0.8 percentage point, from 10.5 to 11.3. Now, this is really surprising because of the fact that we prepared the BIHAR Economic Survey for last 16 years. We have been doing it. And in spite of the limitations of the data that you have, BIHAR is growing at a faster rate than the national economy. Is growing at a faster rate. We are not able to feel this factor because of the fact that the increased growth rate is eaten up by the higher population growth rate. Our population growth is at least 1 percentage point more than the national growth rate. We are probably at the level of 2%, and national is probably 1%. But nevertheless, within BIHAR, it's a growth process. But unfortunately, this growth process is not reflected in the rural to urban migration. As I said before, in spite of having, if not double digit, at least close to 78% growth rate in the last 15, 20 years, the urbanization has not gone up in BIHAR. That always makes me think why it is so. I come from a small town in West Bengal, where during the 60s, when I was in school, the population was barely less than 25,000. It's a district headquarter. So in spite of being a backward district, the town, it's called Shiuri, if anyone will know, has a population of less than 25,000. Within 25 years, by 85, I'm checking 65 to 80, no, 55 to let us say 25 years, the population went up by almost 1 lakh plus. Right now it is 1.5 lakh plus. How did this happen? It's not that there was a great industries in my hometown, but although districts as is a rather backward district, the agriculture in the district is not that bad, thanks to a canal system. And what happened during 60s and 70s, many of the rural households had 2 houses, one in their village and one in my hometown, Shiuri. And it was principally because they wanted to educate their children, which was not available in the villages or even the nearby towns. Okay. So for about 15 to 20 years, they will be having 2 homes, one in the village and one in the town. And sons and daughters, maybe along with mother, will stay in houses. I expected the same process to happen in BIHAR also, but it did not happen. One of the reasons is that, although Amrita mentioned that our economic development policy has urban bias, this urban bias is for the bigger towns, not for the smaller towns. Okay, that makes a lot of difference. In Patna also, we will get a metro railway very soon. We have number of flyovers and etc. But smaller towns in Bihar, less than 40,000 people, do not receive any kind of privilege that bigger towns get. This is a all India phenomenon. And this is a very wrong policy which prevents shifting of people from rural to urban areas and releasing the pressure of unemployment in the rural economy. Rural labor market even now continues to be as tight as it was, say, 30 years ago, because family do not live from there. That's one point I wanted to make, which is in the case of urbanization in general, and which has, rural-urban migration in particular. That's the one. Another thing that whenever I go to Kolkata, I make it a point to talk some of the Biharis there. Many of them, over 2 generations, have upgraded them from casual workers to small entrepreneurs. Most of the cigarette punch or shops in South Calcutta, at least, are owned by Biharis. They're owned by Biharis. But those who are still in the casual employment, like taxi driver or vegetable seller or petty train, they are there. They have been there for 15 years or even more, but they don't bring their family. Okay, so in spite of the fact that their income is not very low, but unless they get an assured source of income, which means ownership of a shop for most of them, this worker migration is not translated into family migration. But number of people who have done family migration, Bihari migrants I'm talking about in Kolkata, it's a very huge number. And I have talked to many of them. They are not coming back to Bihar in any sense of the term. They are not there not because of Kolkata's life, because of the fact that they employ the.
Could I ask you to keep a watch on the time, please, Deepa?
Okay, I just take one point. In the book, everything was okay. Only table where I found it difficult to digest the figures is the composition of the income in the rural households. Sometime back, probably at least 10 years back, I had done a study of the Muslim households. And in my study, the proportion of the share of remittance income in Muslim households was something like 20%, maybe slightly less, 18%. In contrast, the figure that I get from your study, of course it varies, but it is as high as 55 or 58% in Gopalganj. Gopalganj, of course, is known for out-migration for long period, but we must remember that Gopalganj's agriculture is not that bad. It has a serious irrigation, it has a wide irrigation system. And agriculture in Gopalganj is fairly good, not excellent like South Bihar, but it's fairly good. In that context, I find the figure 55 or 55% of remittance share is slightly difficult. Probably we need some answer. These are the comments I have. Thank you, Amrita, again.
Thank you very much, VP. Now let me give the floor to Divya.
Thank you, Professor Rogers, and good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here on this esteemed panel. First of all, like many congratulations to Amrita on this excellent work. I think it makes a very significant contribution to the knowledge on migration in the country today, and especially in a scenario where the availability of data is so disproportionately scant for a phenomenon of this enormous magnitude. So I think this book really plays an important role in establishing evidence from the ground. And the most fascinating thing, of course, was the longitudinal analysis, which I think is quite valuable and very rare, as far as I know, in the entire collection of migration writings from the country. The book, of course, establishes important connections between increasing dependence of household incomes on migration and the positive correlation between migration and high household incomes. While on the other hand, income from agriculture and rural non-farm sector is consistently dwindling. And this really corresponds and I think resonates with our experience in Rajasthan, which is another high out-migration state in the country. So there are many similarities that I see from the data that you've presented with our own work in the high out-migration regions there in rural Rajasthan. So I think all of this really points to the need for a meaningful and inclusive policy framework to ensure that migration can become more secure and dignified. And in this context also, I think you make a very pointed critique about policies in India being framed in silos between rural and urban areas, and the need to engage really with the spatiality of migration as something that really unfolds in between this continuum. I think that point as something that really contributes to the policy imagination on migration is really very critical. And we are all really well aware of how COVID amplified the fragility of migrants, and at the same time that also really contributed to a lot of policy spotlight on this. But from our experience currently on the ground, I think a lot of fragilities still continue unabated, and in many cases their conditions have actually worsened through the years post-COVID. So as some of you know, Ajivika Bureau works both in the source regions in Rajasthan as well as in destination regions, and we work in some of the most dense kind of urban clusters in the country today, that are prominent receiving regions like Mumbai, Pune, Ahmedabad, and Surat. And some of the evidence that I want to share with you today, which I hope will also complement some of Amrita's findings in the book, is directly drawn from our engagement with workers on the ground and our efforts in really mobilizing workers from the field. And a lot of these are very fresh insights from as recent as December of last year. So just wanted to say that, in the post-COVID scenario, we've been seeing an increasing kind of flexibilization of employment arrangements and labor relationship. And the availability of work itself has shrunk, but the supply of labor has increased a fair bit. And so that has really contributed to this increasing casualization of work itself in this already, very heavily segmented urban labor markets that we work in. For example, most workers across cities, especially those seeking construction work daily at the Nakas, report that they only get 10 to 15 days of work in a month. And unskilled workers sometimes work for even lesser number of days, like 8 to 10 days a month currently. And workers who used to be engaged in waged work before now only receive piece-rated work, which means that there's further sort of flexibilization, and it's very hard to establish a relationship between the employer and the workers. And so really the guarantee of work and the stability of income are now a thing of the past for this worst segment of workers. Many informal workers were employed in the absolute sort of bottom end jobs tell us that work has simply not picked up for them post-COVID. And, we even hear narratives like in earlier times, a worker used to come to the city because he would not even be making an earning of rupees 6,000 per month at his hometown. But now a worker thinks twice before coming because they feel that there's not much of a difference in the earnings in the city because the income levels have really drastically gone down. In some of these urban areas. A lot of workers also report downskilling, that is, skilled workers having to take up unskilled work simply because there's non-availability of skilled work in like recycling industries, factories, industrial sort of clusters. And absolute wage rates have also come down. And this is an example from Mumbai where, unskilled workers in the construction sector used to earn about 700 to 800 rupees per day. But in the recent months, this has come down to about 400 to 500 rupees. And people are just forced to take that up because there's just sheer non-availability of work. Women workers are even more marginalized because they're anyway given the most invisible and low value work in these work environments. But many of them report that they've not had an increase in income or wage rates in the past 7-8 years. And coming to a garment units, some of the units in the garment sectors that we work in, again, there people have reported a drastic reduction in work orders, especially from the domestic markets. I think the export market is still continuing all right, but the domestic kind of demand has gone down. And this has led to a reduction in the workforce, especially of migrant workers in these kind of nano units in the deep ends of the supply chain. So there's increasing pressure on just a few workers, and these workers are only paid on piece rate basis, and they have to work in these very sort of precarious, risky kind of work environments. So we see a lot of workers really pushed to, a highly kind of vulnerable state. And many of them, especially in Mumbai, also report having been evicted from their informal rental housing in urban slums from the housing units to the roads because of their inability to pay rents. So I think we need to remember that, all of these changing kind of work dynamics are actually taking place in a highly informal sort of labor market where workers have no options for social protection, legal recourse, in case of non-payments or accidents or any other occupational hazards that happen to them, or any avenues for collective bargaining, because it's well-known fact that many trade unions, formal central kind of trade unions, don't work with these informal migrant workers, especially in construction or in the industrial sort of settings. So I think coming back to the policy architecture surrounding labor migration, like I said earlier, there was a spotlight and a lot of emerging discourses around migration, but I think a lot of it remains inadequate, both in its design as well as in its implementation. For example, if we talk about the E-Shram Yojana, that was really touted as this all-encompassing data architecture that can capture, different trends and patterns in informal labor migration. And it was a response to the Supreme Court judgment that actually asked the central government to, enumerate migrant workers in the country. But in our experience in enumerating, in kind of enrolling migrant workers onto E-Shram, first, there are several barriers to registration, including having a mobile number, having an Aadhaar card, having a bank account, and having one consistent mobile number consistent spelling across all of these identity documents. So all of that, and that too in English, consistent spelling in English. And secondly, the process is completely online. There are very few offline pathways for migrant workers to actually access them. And that just becomes very, very difficult, especially if there are no mediators or like NGOs like us or CSCs kind of involved in the process. It's almost impossible for an informal migrant worker to actually get enrolled in E-Shram. However, even going beyond the purposes of registration, the functionality itself of E-Shram is still very questionable. So currently it only links workers to an accident insurance scheme where there is a payout of 2 lakh rupees. And its whole promise of portability and integration with other social protection systems has certainly not yet been realized. And the experience with One Nation, One Ration card is also similarly kind of patchy on the ground. In Pune, for example, where we work, even this district collector's office had no clue about the scheme, even after several months of announcement of the scheme. Ration dealers, we've been trying to convince ration dealers to actually give out the food quota under the One Nation One Ration Card scheme, but they have no incentives, special incentives to distribute grains to workers who are outside their catchment area. And workers also themselves don't want to use this because they are concerned that they will lose access to entitlements in their village if they start getting food grains in the city, which is not actually the case. The design is not like that, but there is a complete lack of information and awareness campaigns around the scheme. So I think in the light of all this, the need for an inclusive policy for migrant workers has never been more urgent, and better implementation of a decent work agenda for migrant workers and a robust social protection architecture that addresses the issues of enumeration, recognition, and access. I think that is extremely critical. And that most migrant workers return to the village after their work life suggests that, like you said, Amrita, that, the rural areas are really subsidizing India's kind of urban development. So support to families at source as a very deliberate part of the migration policy framework is also extremely important. The need to activate rural governance structures, the need to address the ruptures in public systems in the rural areas that are affecting development outcomes, and also the importance of women development, women empowerment strategies, because especially in contexts where single male migration is very heavy, so that demand making for these public systems can be effectively done. But going beyond the state, I think it's also important to bring in the accountability of the industry as a critical stakeholder, that can trigger changes across deep supply chains in the country. We are working with many employers in the country today through an initiative called the Social Compact, and I can say that after COVID, really many employers are taking up and sitting up and taking note of the conditions of informal workers. So that also gives researchers and activists like us a critical window of opportunity to really engage with them and advocate about the need for bringing dignity and security for internal migrant workers. So thank you. I'll stop here and look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Divya. Priyanka, how much time do we have?
We can go up. I mean, as of now, it's like 4:45 is the time that we started, but we do have time for discussions as well. And we would also request Janine, if she has her comments, if she could share, of course, with the permission of the chair.
Priyanka, we can go little more, maybe 4:50, 4:55.
Wonderful.
It depends upon theory.
Yes.
Well, yes, but I do these things in close consultation with the powers from IHD. Anyway, so the next unannounced speaker, for those of you who know our work, know that we operate as a family enterprise. The next speaker is Janine.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for giving me the floor. I must say that first to congratulate Amrita for producing a very rich piece of research. And we worked together and we have enjoyed the exchange of ideas and so on. She was able to link local and individual concerns to wider development issues in a very effective way, mostly from both perspective of migrants at source villages and destination centers. But migration is a multidimensional phenomenon, and the links to development issues are numerous. And I would like to perhaps just point to 3 areas of the link of migration and development. First, migration has been a major driver of change in the source villages, and the impact has been very different on the village economy, on income distribution, and Amrita has shown that, but also on gender dimension. And this has been less obvious in the presentation of the book. And migration has induced a tightening of the village labor markets, and the shortage of male labor for agriculture operations had an impact on female labor force participation, and female labor force participation remains a contentious issue in India, which need to be looked closer into. And it has also, the shortage of male labor has an impact on rural wages, both at sources and destination. And the IHD survey has shown that women's agency has increased more in high migration villages than in low migration villages, and that could be explained and expanded. The second topic I would like to mention is the link between migration and disease. Obviously, the survey, the IHD survey, the last one was before the COVID. And I would like to refer to a table in your chapter 3, which gives the reason of return migration. The first reason was 42% of the interviewed migrants gave circumstances as their main reason. But the second reason was 26% of the interviews gave health problems. And according to because of the insalubrity, working condition and living condition in urban area, it has been a real problem, and we saw that in our interviews. And it's one of the example of the social security is given at the village. And a lot of research has been done in migration and linking migration with specific disease. For example, migration and tuberculosis, both in high-income countries like the United States. More. The two diseases which have been more researched are tuberculosis and migration, and HIV/AIDS and migration, but it's much more wider. And the third topic I would like to mention is the impact of migration on regional inequalities. Ravi has mentioned that there was a decline on poverty, a decline in inequality, but BIHAR has been at the bottom of the Indian states in terms of economic performance or human development index. So it would be quite interesting to see what has along the year of migration, how the regional inequalities have been evolving. So I want to take more than those three topics, but I hope that Amrita will continue to dig into more deeply in some of these topics, and especially because migration is continued to be an economically and politically sensitive topic. We have seen that the latest proposal of giving distance voting rights to, so it would be interesting to see. I hope that you will continue your good work. Thank you.
Thank you, Janine. And before giving the floor back to Amrita to respond to some of these, we have a few questions have come in from participants, which you might, some of them are more difficult to answer than others. But first we have C.S. Verma, who raised the issue of access to PDS services, that migrants don't have access to PDS services in most states, and he highlighted Maharashtra and Gujarat, and was asking what was the reason for the lack of effort by states to deal with this. A couple of questions from Nisha Srivastava. That's another family enterprise, of course. She raised, first of all, she was raising the question of growth of non-farm income of non-migrants, and raised the issue of commuting, whether or not what is happening is that many workers in rural areas are are working in cities and living in villages. And so the whole issue of commuting and how that connects with migration seems to be on the table. And the second point that she raised was when migrants migrate as a family, whether this doesn't influence return migration subsequently. And there, Sanka Bhomik raised a couple of points. He asked about the impact of household size as a determinant of migration, but he also was asking about the impact of migration on the overall growth of agriculture in Bihar. The last question, which is actually related to Janine's points by Vinny and Prerna, is about the impact of migration on the women left behind in the context of low workforce participation of women, which is exactly one of the points that Janine made. So Amrita, you have the floor for, I guess, 10 to 15 minutes to respond, if you would like to take that much time.
Right. Thanks so much, Jerry. And I'm really grateful to all the panelists for their deep engagement with the book and their comments. And, I must say, it's been a great privilege to be associated with this longitudinal study. And it's been a great pleasure working on this for so long with Jerry, with Alitha, with Janine, with the entire research team. So I'm really grateful to be a part of it. I think, coming to the questions, this Ravisa mentioned about, how is it that migration existed with stabilities in the past and why is it not so anymore? So I think this is a broader issue of the relationship of the rural with the urban and how the urban has been privileged, more recently. And I think this sort of, shows in the book I discuss how in the early 20th century, leaving the village was viewed as losing land, and that is something that the upper caste did not prefer to do. So largely, folks who migrated permanently out of the village were those at the bottom of the social and economic ladder, largely Dalits, who could find a much better life outside. And on the other hand, now, if we look at our data, we know that permanent migration of the kind that entails the movement of the entire household from the village is very, very low. And even among those who permanently migrate, it's largely today the people at the top of the economic and social spectrum. So first, you need to have the financial resources to be able to migrate. And so I think the whole nature of the imagination of the rural and urban, the decline of the rural, not only in terms of the economy, but in terms of a place where people want to live, stay, be, it sort of corroborates why there is so much, I would say, strife in this. So maybe, some pointers there. Then there was this question by P.P. Ghosh sir, he was talking about the income figures. I mean, we all know how hard it is to collect income data. And what we largely did was income accounting exercise for the previous year. And what we also, you're right, our numbers for agriculture income are quite low. But it's also coming from the space where we deduct anything that has been used for self-consumption. So, but we do see the pattern. We do see a decline in agricultural income over time, and that is quite consistent. So by the time we come to 2016, only about 20% of overall income is coming from agriculture. Of course, in southern Bihar, there's capitalist agriculture, so the numbers are slightly higher there. And I think this also links very closely with Nisha ma'am's question, the bit about the farm and non-farm income. So we know very well that agricultural incomes have declined, and there's been a simultaneous increase in farm and non-farm, in remittances and non-farm incomes. Now, the whole issue over here is in terms of employment opportunities, non-farm work is desirable, but it doesn't really exist in the, as much as people would like. So we do find very clearly that wherever there is, when people are able to commute for work, they would engage in non-farm work, right? So we are not, we are not really saying that non-farm opportunities are growing. We do know how constrained rural Bihar is in terms of provision of non-farm employment, but we do clearly find an increase in non-farm income. But, this is a whole chicken and egg situation with migration, because migration has increased, remittance income has also increased. And very often then migration becomes both a cause and consequence of the lack of local development, right? And then, the next question, which has to do with migrants and their families. So, there is no way migrants can afford to have their families in the city. Many of them would like to do so, but their wages don't allow them to. And we have pretty much, I think more than 80% of the migrants do not migrate with families. When they do, they are actually, the women are largely associational migrants, and they accompany male migrant members. And so therefore, the whole desire to go back, it's, there is of course a pull from the family in the rural, but there is also the push from the city, which is exclusionary. And I think how these two interact with one another goes on to explain this whole circular nature of migration, right? Coming to the first question by Dr. Verma, I think Divya explained this very well in her remarks, that despite portability, despite one nation, one ration card, we don't have, which is technically now supposed to provide ration at destination area, this is not happening. So, but I do understand that in intrastate migration, so wherever, where there is inter-district, intrastate migration, portability is far more successful than interstate migration. Though our policies, now make it possible, it's not really happening in the field. Then there's this question about, did you consider household size or workforce participation rate? So what we did consider was, we considered if there was a female, female migrant, female worker in the household to estimate the determinants of migration. We found that it does not make, it is not significant in explaining migration. And, the bit about agricultural growth in the state and increasing migration. So I think largely, although on the one, we find that the agriculture has substantially declined in rural household income. And we also find that young people are quite averse to working in agriculture. So while young people would like very much to have local non-agricultural opportunities, there is an aversion to work in agriculture. And, in villages in North Bihar, you only have the elderly and women and even disabled people working in agriculture. So how do you explain this? I think this is a bit of a paradox, and I think this is largely also got to do with how the structure of the economy is changing. And then, so this is sort of, with Vinny's question, and, Janine also mentioned this, that there's very little gender analysis, but we do find from work that we've done previously, one of the impacts of male migration is an increase in women's mobility in rural Bihar. And so, it works both ways. Once men migrate, there's an income effect, and women are able to withdraw from the workforce. That's largely seen in a positive perspective because they are able to, say, withdraw from menial agricultural labor and so on. But then at the same time, one of the positive effects of male migration has been increase in women's agency and their mobility. Then the definition of migration. So that's I think that's a very important question. I didn't go, the time was short. So largely what our surveys do is they define the household slightly more differently than any other conventional survey would do. And that is to be able to accommodate for migration in a realistic manner. So for us, a household, we use a typical, sociological definition of the household where if members eat from the same kitchen, that is commensality, but we include those members who may be away for a period of up till 12 months. We consider them as members of the household if they've visited once in the last 12 months. And these are largely the migrants which are captured in our household. And then we go on to include remittances sent by migrants, not household income, but remittances sent by migrant, not migrant income, but remittances sent by migrant in the household income. So therefore, what we are able to do is we are able to capture the situation of the household in a manner where household members are accounted for, and the remittances as well are accounted for. Right. The other thing, Janine's bit about health, I think health is really important, and it was quite striking for me as well, that result that such a significant number of returned migrants said that health was one of the reasons that they came back. And I do think both health as well as, we keep talking about the masculinized migration, but I also think there is some autonomous female migration that's going on. And I think that needs to be captured and studied as well. And right.
I think, Amrita, that many questions have come in, and I don't think there's going to be time to address them all, because we several came in the last 10 minutes. I think it's probably time to wrap up now, and some of these questions you can probably address in direct exchange with the people concerned. So yeah, would you like to wrap up?
Right. Okay. So no, I'll get back to the questions personally, and right. No, I just want to say that for me, it's been really fascinating to work on this, one survey and the next, and then the next, and then over the last couple of years, putting it all together, doing, moving beyond the framework of economics, treading into other disciplines. So it's been a very rewarding journey, and I'm very grateful that I've had the time and chance to do this. And I do continue to work on migration. So yeah, and so that's about it. And I'd like to thank IHT for organizing this, for Priyanka, who's, despite her injury, is very much there, and all my colleagues at IHT, starting from Sunil Mishra to Subodh and Viken and Ashwani, Vikas, who worked with the data for such a long time, and the other people beyond IHT, Ragini, who also worked with the data and helped with the reports. So I'm very grateful, and I feel very happy that we've had this event. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Amrita, and many congratulations for a remarkable contribution to the literature. And the intensity of this debate shows that you are actually stimulating a lot more discussion around these issues, which, as I think Janine said, we hope you're going to continue to dig into these questions further. I think there's a lot to be done on the basis of the work that you have done so far. Thank you, Amrita, and thank you also to our discussants for their contribution to this event, which I think was extremely successful. And with that, I think we are closing the event. Thank you all very much indeed.
So I'll just say thank you so much, Jerry, to all the panelists. Many congratulations, Amrita, for this book, and we expect to see many more coming out from academic endeavors, like culminating into these publications from you. Thank you to all the participants. There have been few engagements on Facebook as well. So as I always say, I'll make a compendium of all the questions, and I'll share with you with their email IDs. Maybe you'll be able to engage with them on a personal basis. Thank you so much. Thank you to all the attendees. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to the moderator, Professor Sharma, and everyone at IHT, which is IHD wishes everyone a very happy new year. Finally, our work on BIHAR, which Amrita and I had created a micro website on our website. If you remember, Amrita, we have the research program on BIHAR. Please visit our website. You will get to know a lot of work done by Dr. Jerry Rogers, Ms. Janine Rogers, Amrita Datta, and many more, Professor Alakin Sharma, and many more who have worked on this topic. Please visit our website. This book discussion has been recorded, and we'll put it up on our YouTube channel as well. If you can revisit this for any further information on this topic. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Janine. Thank you to all.
Thank you, Priyanka.
Thanks.
Yeah, okay, bye.